So now let's talk about what a relational database is. So it's important to be thinking about what database type you're going to be using when you start developing your app so that you can think about how the database system and how you're going to be storing that data is going to be designed, right? So when we talk about a relational database system, one of the things we've talked about before is schemas. So you're going to create a table, and when you create the table, you're going to create different columns in the table, and those different columns are going to accept different values, right? A name, an age, a shirt size, a part number, a description, that type of thing, right? And that's the schema. So let's say we have a table here, and that table is for parts, right? And so basically we separate this into multiple different columns, right? And so the first column might be the ID, so some kind of a number, right? A serial number or something for that type of part. Then we have a name, so basically what is the name of the part? And then we have a description, how big is the part, how small the part, the color of the part, all of that kind of thing. And then we might have something like a price here, something along those lines, how much it costs to buy the part. Now at the end, one of the things that we might have is a vendor ID number. And what this vendor ID number is going to do is this is going to be used to associate this part with a different table. So when you start thinking about relational databases, the important thing to consider here is basically we want to try to compartmentalize or siloize each type of record. Right? So we're going to have a part record here, and this is going to have all the information for the different parts. Well, then what we're going to do over here is we're going to have a vendor table, right? So we're going to have a vendor table here with vendor records. And so in here, we'll have a vendor ID, we'll have a name for the vendor, and we may have the address and the contact information for the vendor, we may have the payment plan or whatever else we have for the vendor, and all of that stuff is over here in the vendor table. And so with a relational database, what we're able to do is instead of storing all of this information in the parts table, we can have this vendor table, and then we can simply point to the vendors as need be, right? So we have different records here in the parts, right? This is something, this is something, this is something, this is something, and then this goes to vendor 1, blah, 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 and this goes to vendor 2, blah, 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 and this goes back to vendor 1, right? You have multiple parts from the exact same way. Vendor, blah, 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 vendor 3, so on and so forth. Over here we have 1, 2, 3. These are the IDs for the vendors. So basically when you do a query and you print out all the information on the screen, or if you're using something like Python, like a back-end programming language, and you go to do a query, you can get the information not just for the part, but you can join these tables together. It's called a join at that vendor ID number. So now you can get all of the information back at one time. And again, if you have like this part here connects up to this vendor record, right, this can all come back as one query. So you can say, okay, so this is the part and the part name, this, and the vendor name and the vendor information and that type of deal. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about a relational database, is that you're going to have all of these different tables, and then they will have relationships with each other with basically these shared column values, so that you can essentially kind of like super glue them together so in order to get results from all of these tables when you make a single query. So the way that we're able to connect these tables together is by using something called a join. Again, there's an inner join, a left join in the SQLite world. When you go over to MySQL, other database engines, there's right joins. There's a whole bunch of joins out there. We'll actually have a session on joins quite a bit further. It's like, 13 sessions from here. But we will talk about joins later. Don't worry about that too much right now, other than the fact that they do exist. But one of the important things with relational databases is in order to do a join, you actually have to be able to join on some particular value, right? So we have a vendor ID number here. In the vendor table, we have an ID number there. And so basically, we're connecting these two things together. So one of the things that you need to be thinking thinking about is, again, how with a relational database, what basically values are you actually going to be able to join on. Now you hear of something called a primary key. So again, if you're using Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB, primary keys are something that you actually by default have to configure. And what that primary key is that unique identifier for all of the records in a particular table. Normally you auto increment, so it's an int that gets auto incremented. So the first record is 1, the second record is 2, third record is 3, blase, blase, blase. And so then you can simply, connect based off of that record number. And that's how it works. We will talk a little bit later about row IDs and primary keys and where that can be a weird issue, again, when you start to get into joins. But basically here, just realize you do have to join on that particular value. And so it's something that you're going to have to think about when you're designing your overall database, architecture and system. Now I'm going to show you a little example on how you use SQL to join these tables together. If you do not fully understand it right now, don't worry. You're very early in this series. You have a lot more classes to go. But basically here what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a table called part. So like I kind of showed you up here. So we create a table named part. It will have a column for name, it'll have a column for description, and it will have a column for vendor ID. And we are going to close with a semicolon. That's a delimiter in the SQL world. We're then going to create a table for vendor. When we create the table for vendor, we're going to create this thing called a primary key. So vendor, we're going to have the vendor underscore ID, so that's the vendor ID, is an integer, that is a data type, we'll talk about later, is also a primary key, and it gets auto incremented. Every time a record is created, that value goes up by 1, and then we just have a name here because I want to try to keep it simple, right? So this, the part table is going to have a name description with a vendor ID in it, and then the vendor table is simply going to have a vendor ID and a name for the particular vendor. If we come down here, basically we can see with SQLite, I'm doing something called a select all from part. So I created a number of records in the part table. So widget is a thingy, and it's associated with vendor number 3. Sprocket is another thingy, is associated with vendor number 2. Ratchet is yet another thingy. 1, washer, another thingy 2, and a doodad is another thingy with absolutely nothing over here. Basically down here, we can go take a look at our vendor table. So select all from vendor. Basically here, this is where we have our primary keys that are getting printed out. So the vendor ID is 1, 2, and 3, and the name is Cool Company, a Better Company, and Amazeballs Inc., right? So basically, this is what we're associating by. So widget is a thingy that is made by Amazeball Inc., right? Sprocket is another thingy that is made by Better Company, right? We are joining based off of that ID. If we come down here and we take a look, this is what a join looks like. So select part.name, so from the part table, I want the name column, comma, part.description, from the part table, I want the description, vendor.name, so from the vendor table, I want the name, from part, so this is where we say from the part table, something called inner join vendor on part.vendorID equals vendor.vendorID. Now again, this is all just trying to put this on the screen. Normally this would all be on like one line or something like that, but again with, trying to blow this up so you can see it, that's why it's on multiple lines. So basically we're doing this thing called an inner join, so part.vendorID equals vendor.vendorID, right? And so then when this gets printed out on the screen, widget, a thingy by Amazeballs Inc. Sprocket, another thingy by Better Company. Ratchet, another thingy by a Cool Company. And Washer, another thingy by a Better Company. And so that's what we're talking about with joins. And basically here is the magic of the relational database, right? So you can have different tables that are specifically used to store different types of records. And then with this thing called joins, we're basically able to superglue those tables together so that we can get results like this.